Hi, so I tried to make a language revision video earlier and it didn't work. I was trying to do it from the top of my head and I couldn't, I don't know, my brain wasn't working properly and it's still probably not working properly, but I've drank a little bit of coffee so that might have helped, I don't know. Okay, so I'm basically gonna not even do language, I'm gonna go through this 20 questions on the ontological argument. 1 minute. Yeah, so I'm gonna go through 20 questions on the ontological argument. Try not to look at the answers until I've at least had a go at answering the question, so I'll probably have to fold it over so I can't actually see the answers while I'm looking at the sheet. Not that I'm going to cheat anyway. Would I do that? No. Yeah, right. Okay, so what are deductive arguments? A deductive argument is an argument whereby if the premises are true, then the conclusion must also be true. Yeah, an inductive argument is one which is based on evidence from the world. So deductive is like logic, you can work it out using reason or logic, but inductive is where you look at the evidence from the world in order to derive a conclusion. So, okay, what does the word ontos mean? The word ontos means being. Is the ontological argument deductive or inductive? The ontological argument is deductive because it's based on logic. It's not an argument like the teleological or the cosmological argument, which look at phenomena in the world and then derive the conclusion of God. It's one which uses a definition of God, and so it's sort of like it uses an analytic statement of God. Okay, so Anselm proposes a definition of God, which is God is that than which no greater can be conceived. And then throughout his argument, he develops it and says, well, greater things exist in reality as well as in the mind. So for God to be that than which no greater can be conceived, God must also exist in reality as well as in the mind. Otherwise, greater things would exist in reality which are not God, and that is a contradictory statement. It's contradictory for something greater to exist which is greater than God, because God is that than which no greater can be conceived. So for us to deny that God is that than which no greater can be conceived, which is inherent to God's nature, would be to commit a logical fallacy. So in that sense, the argument does work because it's analytic and because it's based on logic. It does seem to work, but there is problems with it, obviously, because it uses circular reasoning, and also you could just reject the whole idea of God in the first place, and the argument doesn't work. Like, you could just throw out the whole idea of God, and I think that was one of Kant's criticisms. And Kant also said, well, existence is not a real predicate. Existence doesn't add to something. Like, Peter Vardy used an example of a car. So he says, well, you've got a car. It's made up of components. Those components may consist of a stereo, a steering wheel, wheels, the bodywork, an engine, an exhaust. All of those are components to the car, but the existence of the car doesn't actually tell us anything about the car. It just tells us that all of those components are in existence. It doesn't add anything to the car. It just tells us it exists. However, some people have refuted this Kantian criticism of the ontological argument and said, well, actually, existence is a predicate because it tells us that the car is in existence. It tells us that we're able to use the car. It tells us that it's not just something metaphysical. It actually does have a body and it actually is existent. So, obviously, I don't know. It does depend on how we look at it. Anyway, I've jumped ahead a little bit there, so I'll go back to the questions. I may have already explained some of these things in that little discussion, but yeah. Who developed the ontological argument? I assume this is Anselm. Anselm, yeah. Also, with the deductive... Oh, I missed one. Is the ontological argument deductive or inductive? So, it's deductive and it's a priori because it's based on logic and not experience. I may have actually just done that one, I can't remember. Who developed the ontological argument? Anselm. What is a scholastic? Now, a scholastic is somebody who merges faith with philosophy. So, you might think of religion and faith as just something where you just have faith. You don't reason your beliefs. You just believe in God for no reason. You don't think about it. You just do it because that's what you've been told by the church, and that's what you derive from the scriptures. Whereas philosophers, they're more likely to be critical and actually think about things. So you can see, based on the ontological argument, that Anselm is a scholastic because he merges faith with philosophy. He creates an analytical and a priori deductive theory around the existence of God. He doesn't just accept that there's this transcendent being who is looking over us and loving us. He actually tries to be thoughtful about it. So that's a scholastic, someone who merges faith with philosophy. How did he define God? Now, I've already covered this, but that is that than which no greater can be conceived, or that than which no greater can be thought. So in other words, God's basically the greatest being ever. What is this first form of the argument? Okay, what is this first form of the argument? Right, I think I've just covered this as well. So if God is that than which no greater can be conceived, then God must exist in reality as well as in the mind, because real things are better than imaginary things, and nothing can be greater than God, because God is that than which no greater can be conceived. And that's essentially the first form of the argument. I think that's the totality of it anyway. That than which no greater can be thought, or no greater can be conceived in the mind. Oh, yeah. Okay. How might a pile of money illustrate the first form of the argument? So, a pile of money illustrates the first form of the argument because, well, you would much rather have a real pile of money than an imaginary pile of money. And you'd much rather have real things than imaginary things because you can actually use them in reality. So this is basically, it doesn't really matter about what you put in that space. It's just the fact that reality is better than non-reality, is greater than non-reality, for good things anyway. I guess you could, but then again, well, what is good things? But yeah, so a real God is better than an imaginary God, is the point that he's trying to make. What is the second form of the argument? So the second form of the argument is the idea that God is necessary and eternal. So God must exist. He can't not exist. It would be a logical fallacy again to say that God doesn't exist, because necessity is in his nature. You can't say that a necessary being doesn't exist, because it doesn't make any sense to say that. However, we can argue again that Anselm is just attributing this label of necessity to God, of necessary to God, and then he's using that to define God into existence almost. And we'll come on to this in a minute with Gowney law. So yeah, he's basically playing with words. It's like it could be just a semantical argument in that it works in itself, but does it actually necessarily tell us anything about the nature of reality? But we can link this to, well, this does link to the cosmological argument as well, with contingency and necessary. The idea that we need a necessary being, because everything in reality is contingent. All things are contingent. They could or could not exist. That means that at one point, there was a point in time when nothing existed at all. And I guess you could argue that not even time existed. So there must have been a necessary being which brought things into existence, because according to Aristotle, and this was adopted by Aquinas, nothing can come from nothing. Therefore, God was that unmoved mover, or that first cause, and that prime mover which brought things into being and kept things in motion. So it's not just related to the ontological argument that God is necessary. It goes into other arguments as well. So maybe that gives it a little bit more validity, because it's not just that Anselm's playing a word game with this specific argument, which he didn't actually call it the ontological argument, by the way, that was Kant. But it's not that he's just attributed the label necessary to God. It's that, like, other arguments as well also use the same label of God, because, well, I guess you can derive it through logic and say, well, it is better to be necessary than contingent, because if you're contingent, then you're dependent on other things for your existence. whereas a necessary being is not contingent on other things for its existence. It exists in and of itself. It is self-sufficient. And that is clearly better than being dependent on other things, because that means you could or could not exist. And that's clearly not as good. And if God is that than which no greater can be conceived and no greater can be thought, then it's better to be necessary. So logically, if God does exist, then he would be necessary. But again, we don't know whether God does exist. And this argument's been known to strengthen the beliefs of those who already believe, but it hasn't really been famous for converting people. And I think some modern scholars who support this argument are Albert Plantinga, and I can't remember the others, but Norman Malcolm and Keith Ward. I'm not going to have time to finish this video. I've got 4 minutes left of recording. But I've covered most of it anyway, without going through the questions. What are the 2 attributes you must give to God for the second argument? Necessary and eternal. I've been through this. Eternal, linking to Boethius, basically means outside of time. God must exist outside of time because time is contingent on the universe. Therefore, God must exist outside of that, because if he brought the universe into being, he brought space and time into being. He couldn't have existed within that time before that time existed, because it doesn't make sense to talk about before time existing. So God exists outside of time, and if God did exist inside of time and time was brought into being, then that would suggest that God wasn't immutable. God must change, because then God would have to move from outside of time into time. Therefore, it makes more sense to say that God is eternal and that he exists outside of time. Okay, which contemporary thinker criticised the argument? So this was Gownilo. I think there's different ways you can say that, but I'm going to say Gownilo because that's the way I've been taught it. And Gownilo basically said you can't define things into existence, and that's exactly what he thinks Anselm is doing with God. He's putting forth a definition and saying, well, God is that on which no greater can be conceived, and therefore God must exist in reality. Well, he says, well, he thinks of an island, and he's like, well, this is the greatest island that can be conceived, therefore my island must also exist in reality. And what he's trying to outline here is that it doesn't work. You can't just define things into existence. You could apply this to any number of things and say, well, that must exist in reality as well. But then Anselm refutes this and says, well, no, because God's not like an island. He's not made out of matter. He's different. He's transcendent and eternal. So it's up to you as to how much of a shutdown criticism you want to make this to be. But you do have to take into account that perhaps, I don't know, both sides of the story, I guess. I'm really trying to finish this. I've got a minute left. What was Aquinas' criticism? Aquinas said we cannot define God. So therefore, the whole of the ontological argument is based on a definition of God of which we can't know whether it's true or not. So Aquinas wouldn't necessarily be for the argument. Kant argued existence is not a real predicate, but I've already been through this. What does the missing word from... Oh, predicate is quality of something. I've been through that as well. How did Hume attack the second form of the argument? Well, I'm not sure if I can actually remember, and I don't think I've got enough time to go through it, but yeah. Okay, Hume said, nothing is demonstrable unless the contrary implies a contradiction. We can imagine that God exists or doesn't exist, and therefore he is not logically necessary. Who has defended the argument in modern times? We've been through this as well. Norman Malcolm, Albert Plantinga, and Keith Ward. Who did Barth think the argument was most useful for? Believers, been through that. Some say the argument doesn't work because reality tested by empirical evidence. What is this? Empirical evidence is experience of the senses, and I've got 7 seconds left, but I've pretty much covered it, apart from Descartes, who also had a version of this, but I haven't got time to